A woman named Claire had always been the picture of the perfect wife. She was loving, attentive, and devoted to her husband, Jack. They lived a quiet life in a small town, with a routine that seemed unbreakable. However, beneath her charming exterior, Claire had a secret. She had been having an affair with her coworker, a man named Richard. This affair had started innocently, just a few lingering glances at the office, but over time, it spiraled into something more. Jack, the ever-trusting husband, had no idea. He was oblivious to the late-night texts and secretive phone calls. Claire's guilt had been eating her up inside, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Her relationship with Richard was passionate and thrilling, something Jack could never provide her. However, the more Claire saw Richard, the more she began to change. She became distant, colder, and less interested in her husband. Jack noticed the changes, but every time he tried to talk to her, she would brush him off with excuses. He could feel something was wrong but couldn't put his finger on it. One night, after a particularly heated argument about their lack of intimacy, Claire made a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. She had been toying with the idea of ending the marriage, but her affair had reached a point where it seemed inevitable. She was planning to leave Jack for Richard. But as she walked through the door that evening, Jack confronted her. He could see the guilt in her eyes, and it was the final piece of the puzzle. He demanded the truth. Claire broke down and confessed everything: the affair, her feelings, her betrayal. Jack stood there in silence, the weight of her words crashing over him. For a moment, he felt nothing but heartbreak. But then something inside him snapped. A rage, unlike anything he'd ever felt before, started to build. In a strange, almost supernatural way, it felt as if a dark power was awakening inside him. In the heat of his fury, Jack felt a change. His emotions twisted into something unrecognizable. His pupils turned a deep shade of black, and his skin felt as though it was being pulled into itself. He was no longer the man Claire had married. He was something else, something far darker. It was as if his pain had morphed into a demon, and now it was manifesting in front of her. Claire, terrified by the transformation, tried to apologize, but it was too late. Jack's mind had already crossed into another realm, one where vengeance was the only thing that mattered. His once loving gaze was now filled with malice. Claire tried to flee, but her husband, now a demon in every sense of the word, stopped her with ease. His voice was a low growl as he spoke. "You've made me this way. You've turned me into this creature." The next few days were a blur for Claire. Jack no longer resembled the man she had once known. His presence was suffocating, his eyes burning with anger and resentment. He demanded that she live with the consequences of her actions, and his torment was endless. Claire realized too late that she had destroyed everything: her marriage, her husband's humanity, and any chance of redemption. As the story spread, Jack became a legend in their town. Some whispered that he had truly become a demon, consumed by the darkness of betrayal. Others believed he was just a man broken beyond repair. But one thing was certain: Claire's affair had turned her husband into something unrecognizable, and in the process, she had lost him forever. The audio of this story, shared by an anonymous user on Reddit, became a viral sensation. Listeners were captivated by the haunting tale of betrayal, transformation, and the destructive power of guilt. The story left everyone with one chilling message: sometimes, the consequences of our actions are far worse than we can ever imagine. As days turned into weeks, the town began to notice the subtle, chilling changes in Claire and Jack's lives. The once gregarious couple had been reduced to shadows of their former selves. Claire, who once enjoyed walks through the town square and chats with neighbors, now rarely left the house. She lived in constant fear of the man, or the demon, her husband had become. Jack's transformation was not just physical. His eyes had a glint of something otherworldly, his posture unnaturally rigid. He never spoke unless he needed to, his words filled with venom. When he did speak to Claire, it was only to remind her of her betrayal, to make her feel the weight of her guilt every single day. There were moments when Claire could swear she saw him physically change, his hands growing sharper, his features distorting in subtle, horrifying ways. But he was no longer her husband. He was something else, something far darker. In the middle of the night, she would hear strange noises from downstairs, heavy footsteps that sounded too large for a human. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but the sounds grew louder. One night, she gathered enough courage to go downstairs and find out what was happening. As she approached the living room, the sight that met her eyes was enough to freeze her in place. Jack was standing by the fireplace, his back to her. But something was wrong. His shadow stretched unnaturally, moving like it had a life of its own. As Claire stepped closer, she noticed that his silhouette no longer matched his physical form. It was larger, more grotesque, with horns that seemed to twist from the shadows themselves. She could barely breathe as she realized that the demon he had become was not just a metaphor, it was real. He had fully transformed into a creature of darkness. "Why are you still here, Claire?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thick, suffocating. "You've unleashed something that can never be undone. You wanted to leave me, to abandon me for him, and now, you have me in a form that will never leave." Claire's heart raced as she took a step back, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. She wanted to plead with him, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in her throat. Jack's eyes, those once warm eyes, were now empty pits of darkness. She could see nothing but the abyss when she looked into them. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." But Jack laughed, a cold, hollow sound that seemed to echo in the very walls of their home. "You already have, Claire. And you'll continue to feel the consequences of your actions for as long as you live." It wasn't just the physical transformation that horrified her. It was the emptiness in his voice, the complete lack of humanity. Jack was gone, replaced by a being who thrived on torment, who reveled in her suffering. Claire had torn him apart with her betrayal, and in doing so, had created something far worse than either of them could have imagined. In the following weeks, the town began to gossip about the couple's sudden disappearance. Claire's friends reached out, but no one heard from her. Jack was rarely seen, but when he was, people said he seemed different, darker. The town, once quiet and peaceful, was now filled with an unsettling tension, as if something sinister had taken root. Then, one day, a package arrived at the doorstep of Claire's best friend, Mary. Inside was a recording, a tape, old and worn, as though it had been kept hidden for a long time. The moment the tape was played, Claire's voice echoed through the speakers, frantic and desperate. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, the sound of her crying barely audible through the static. "I thought I could make it stop. I thought if I left him, if I left Jack, I could escape what I had done. But I was wrong. He's not the man I married anymore. He's something else. And he's not letting me go." The recording cut off abruptly, leaving only the chilling silence. The town never saw Claire again. Some believed she had been swallowed by the demon Jack had become. Others whispered that she was still alive somewhere, trapped in the darkness, unable to escape the consequences of her actions. And as for Jack, he remained a shadow in the town, a dark figure who was both feared and forgotten. His transformation had sealed his fate. He was no longer bound by the rules of humanity, no longer the man who had once loved Claire with all his heart. He was a creature of vengeance, a demon born of betrayal and pain. The audio story of Jack's descent into darkness became an infamous Reddit post, shared countless times by users who were captivated by the terrifying tale. People found themselves unable to turn away from the haunting narrative, warning each other about the price of betrayal and the destructive power of guilt. Jack's story served as a chilling reminder that sometimes the things we do cannot be undone, and that the consequences can be far worse than we ever imagine. In the end, Claire's affair didn't just tear apart her marriage. It had unleashed a nightmare that no one could have predicted. And in that darkness, Jack, once a loving husband, had become something truly terrifying. As months passed, the unsettling aura around the house grew stronger. Neighbors reported strange occurrences, windows rattling violently when there was no wind, a cold draft seeping from the cracks of the old house even on warm summer days, and an oppressive feeling that hung over the property like a storm waiting to break. The once vibrant garden that Claire had lovingly tended to now lay in decay, overgrown with thorny vines that seemed to twist and contort unnaturally, as though trying to reach out and grab anyone who dared approach. Some townsfolk speculated that Claire had fled, unable to face the man, or demon, that Jack had become. But others weren't so sure. They whispered that she had been consumed by the very darkness she had created. It wasn't just her marriage that had broken, it was her spirit. And now, as the demon in Jack grew stronger, Claire was forever trapped in the web of her own making. There was a chilling incident that spread throughout the town like wildfire. One evening, a group of curious teenagers, fueled by the stories they had heard and the dark legends growing around Jack, dared to approach the house. Armed with nothing more than their phones and a sense of adolescent bravado, they crept through the overgrown garden and into the yard. At first, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. The air was heavy with silence, and the house loomed dark and empty, almost as if it had been abandoned long ago. But then, as they ventured closer to the front door, the ground beneath them began to tremble, just slightly, at first. Then louder, more distinct. The temperature dropped, and an eerie low growl echoed from within the house, a sound so deep and guttural it seemed to shake the very foundation of their souls. One of the teenagers, Matt, dared to approach the door. His hand was shaking as he reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, a cold, spectral voice stopped him in his tracks. "Turn back," it whispered, so softly they almost didn't hear it. "This place is cursed. Leave before it consumes you." Matt froze, his eyes wide with terror. His friends, who had been skeptical until that moment, now felt the grip of fear tighten around them. They turned to run, but the door swung open with a screech, as if inviting them into the house. Suddenly, the shadows inside seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, a figure, dark and twisted, stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Jack, but not the Jack they had heard about. This was something far worse, something that couldn't be explained by mere human logic. His eyes burned with an unholy fire, and the darkness surrounding him seemed to pulse with life. The teenagers fled in a panic, stumbling and tripping over each other as they scrambled away from the house, barely escaping the crushing weight of the evil they had witnessed. The last image they would remember was Jack's twisted, demonic smile as he watched them disappear into the night. The following day, the story of the teens' encounter spread like wildfire through the town. Those who had once doubted the rumors about Jack's transformation now spoke in hushed tones, afraid to venture too close to the house. Some said the demon was real, and it was feeding off the pain and betrayal that Claire had caused. Others whispered that Claire's spirit was trapped inside the house, eternally tormented by the consequences of her actions. Days turned into weeks, and the house became more of a legend than a real place. People spoke of it only in whispers, as though the very mention of it could summon the curse. Yet, no one truly knew what had become of Claire, whether she was dead, trapped, or simply lost within the nightmare her betrayal had created. One night, a solitary traveler, passing through the town, decided to investigate. The stories had intrigued him, and his curiosity got the better of him. Armed only with a flashlight and a notebook, he made his way to the abandoned house. Unlike the teens before him, he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As he stepped into the overgrown yard, the temperature dropped sharply, the air growing thick and suffocating. The house stood before him, silent but somehow watching, waiting. He hesitated at the door, but then, drawn by an unnatural force, he entered. The inside of the house was frozen in time, with dust settling over furniture that had once been familiar. But the air was thick with something else, something dark, ancient, and heavy. As he moved deeper into the house, he felt as though he was being watched by eyes that were not there. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing in rhythm with his own fearful heartbeat. And then he heard it. A soft whisper, like the rustling of leaves, followed by a voice, Claire's voice, broken and desperate. "Help me," it pleaded. "Please, help me." The traveler's heart raced as he followed the voice, unsure of whether it was real or a trick of his mind. He reached the basement door, and as his hand touched the cold, rotting wood, a loud crack echoed from below. The ground shifted, and Jack appeared in the doorway, his demonic form standing tall and imposing, eyes glowing with fury. "You shouldn't have come," his voice boomed, a deep, guttural growl. "Now, you will become part of this place, just like the rest of them." With a swift motion, the traveler was yanked into the shadows, his screams swallowed by the house. Days later, his disappearance was reported, but no one could find any trace of him. Some believed he had become another lost soul, another victim of Jack's curse. Others feared that the house itself had grown stronger, feeding on the fear of those who dared to uncover the truth. The story continued to spread, but with each telling, the truth became less clear. Was Jack truly a demon, or had his transformation been a result of his profound grief and rage? Was Claire lost in the house, consumed by the evil that had been born from her betrayal? Or had she been drawn into the darkness, forever trapped in a cycle of torment? The house stood there, decaying and abandoned, its walls holding the dark secrets of the past. And as long as the legend endured, so too would the curse, the consequences of betrayal, of love lost, and of a man forever changed by the darkness within him. As the years went by, the once thriving town that had been overshadowed by the tragic events surrounding Claire and Jack began to forget. Life carried on for most of the townspeople, but the fear remained like a faint whisper, echoing in the background of their lives. New families moved into the area, unaware of the house's cursed history. Yet, the house, with its dark, decaying presence, remained untouched, a reminder of the evil that had once consumed it. One cold winter's evening, a young couple named Sarah and Ryan, looking for a fresh start away from the city, stumbled upon the house while exploring the outskirts of town. They were drawn to the eerie beauty of the place, captivated by its Gothic architecture and the mystery that seemed to hang in the air around it. They didn't know the full extent of the house's dark past, but there was something about it that intrigued them. The couple decided to investigate further. The house was abandoned, its windows boarded up, but Sarah and Ryan saw potential. They believed it could be the perfect project to turn into a charming home. Ignoring the warnings from the locals, they made plans to buy the house and begin their new life there. The first few weeks were filled with renovation work. The couple worked tirelessly to restore the house to its former glory, fixing up the rooms and clearing the overgrown yard. But even as they worked, they couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered in the air, as if they were being watched. The house seemed to have a presence, a force that lingered just beyond their vision. One night, after a long day of work, Sarah decided to stay late in the house to clean up some of the dust and debris. Ryan, exhausted, went to bed early. As Sarah moved through the darkened halls, she felt the temperature drop, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She thought she heard faint whispers, like someone calling her name, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Confused and unsettled, Sarah continued her work, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had settled over her. As she reached the staircase, she saw something move out of the corner of her eye. She froze. The figure was tall and thin, standing motionless at the top of the stairs. It was a shadowy figure, its features barely visible in the dim light, but its eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural fire. They were the same eyes Sarah had seen in the old photographs of Claire and Jack. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was no longer alone. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence oppressive. The whispers grew louder, now clear and distinct, like an angry chant. "Leave this place," the voice hissed, distorted and hollow. "It belongs to us. You have no place here." Frozen in fear, Sarah tried to back away, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped in the oppressive grip of the house's curse. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped her wrist, pulling her towards the stairs. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows. Ryan, hearing his wife's screams, rushed to the stairs. When he reached the hallway, he found Sarah standing at the foot of the staircase, her eyes wide with terror, her body stiff as a board. She was staring at something, her mouth open in silent horror. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What's wrong?" Sarah couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. Her eyes were locked onto something behind Ryan. He turned, expecting to see something that would explain her panic, but there was nothing. Just the dark silence of the house. "Sarah, we need to get out of here," Ryan insisted, grabbing her by the arm. But she remained frozen, as if held in place by an invisible force. Her gaze shifted upward, following the stairs as though she could see something lurking there, something waiting to claim her. Suddenly, the temperature in the house dropped even further. The shadows around them seemed to lengthen and stretch, moving as if alive. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic now, as if the house itself was alive and growing angry at their intrusion. Without warning, the ground beneath them rumbled, the walls creaked, and a dark, looming figure appeared at the top of the stairs, Jack. His form was no longer just a shadow, but a towering demonic presence, his eyes ablaze with an infernal fire. His voice echoed through the house, deep and menacing. "You should not have come," Jack's voice growled. "This place, this curse, is ours." Before they could react, the house itself seemed to close in around them. Doors slammed shut. Windows shattered without cause. The walls groaned as if the house was alive, hungry for the souls that had entered it. The air became thick with dread, and the whispers grew deafening. Ryan pulled Sarah towards the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, ensnared by the very thing they had ignored, the curse of betrayal and darkness that had never truly left. As the figure of Jack descended the stairs, his form becoming more and more monstrous with each step, the couple understood the true horror of the house. It wasn't just a home. It was a prison, a place where souls were condemned to live out their worst nightmares. It was a place where the consequences of betrayal were not just remembered, they were fed upon, consumed, and eternally relived. The last thing Sarah and Ryan heard before the house swallowed them whole was the distant, mournful cry of a woman, Claire's voice, echoing from the walls, forever trapped within the house. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos of Jack's wrath. The next morning, the town noticed that the house was silent. The lights, which had been flickering in the windows the night before, were now dark. The yard, once full of life and activity, stood still. Sarah and Ryan were gone, their car abandoned by the curb, and no sign of them remained in the house. But there was something new. The whispers had returned to the town, and those who passed near the house swore they could hear faint, desperate cries coming from within, as if the house was hungry for more. And so, the legend of the cursed house lived on, a warning to anyone who dared to uncover its secrets. Some betrayals are so deep, so unforgivable, that they create a darkness that can never be undone. The house would continue to claim victims, its curse growing stronger with each soul it consumed, feeding off the pain and suffering of those who ventured too close. The demon that Jack had become, and the woman Claire had unknowingly condemned, remained in the house, waiting for the next to come, for the next betrayal to unlock the door to their torment. The story would continue, a never-ending cycle of darkness and despair.